name's Stuart Patterson. In this episode, we're going to be talking about globalization in theory and what the reality might be. And I wanted to start off with a few observations just taken from newspapers in the last few days. It's been reported quite widely that the Tesla Model 3 is available in China now at a 40% discount to the price tag in the United States. The World Bank, in their latest update of their global database, point out that on a PPP basis, the Chinese currency, the yuan, is still trading at a 40% discount to its fair value 20 years after their accession to the World Trade Organization. And of course, many of our listeners will be well aware that 2023 marks the 30th anniversary of the last time that China actually ran a current account deficit. So against the backdrop of those three empirical observations, I thought I'd just quote from one of my favorite books in terms of history of economic thought and methodology anyway, Leonard Gomes' Neoclassical International Political Economy. And in the preface, he says something very interesting. He says, "Economists are at their best when they speak out on international trade. On such matters, not only do they speak with the almost unanimous backing of professional opinion, but what they do convey tends to command universal respect among the wider lay audience." Now, he was writing in 1990, and I wonder if that is still true. Today, I'm joined by Jeff Ferry. Jeff is the chief economist at the Coalition for a Prosperous America, and Jeff and his team recently won the Menace Award from the National Association for Business Economics for a paper entitled "Decoupling from China: An Economic Analysis of the Impact on the US Economy of a Permanent Tariff on Chinese Imports." Jeff, welcome, and thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Stuart. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, look, I thought I'd just kick off with a reference to that quote. And, Leonard Gomes there is saying that all economists basically speak with one voice, and that he sort of conveys this idea that we've had this progression from ignorance to enlightenment over time when it comes to matters of international trade, and that all economists now speak pretty much with one voice. Do you agree with that?
I think in 1990, that was pretty accurate, and the entire economist community, including myself, by the way, felt free trade and globalization were great things, and there were two stood out who disagreed with that. They were not economists. One was Sir Jimmy Goldsmith in your country, in the UK, and the other was Ross Perot here in the US, who said that if we accept the NAFTA agreement, there'll be a, quote, giant sucking sound, unquote, of jobs going from the US to Mexico. Now it's 30 years later, and you know what? All the economists were wrong. Ross Perot is exactly right. As I speak to you, companies are building more and more factories in Mexico. They produced next to no cars in 1990. Today, they produce some 3 million cars a year. We produce about 13 million. So we're rapidly moving production south. So economists were all wrong. So do they look at their mistake and reconsider what they did wrong and reanalyze the situation? No, not at all. Economists' job is to get government jobs and get good consulting contracts, repeating and repeating ancient untruths.
So in your view then, what was wrong with the sort of orthodox trade theory that was espoused as a sort of support, an intellectual support to the process of globalization?
Orthodox trade theory was based on the short-term equilibrium analysis that began with David Ricardo in the post-Napoleonic age. 30 years later, that was all wrong, and people did not realize it. And what we know since globalization happened is that it leads to greater inequality. The efficiency effects exist, but they're tiny and they're dwarfed by other effects.
Yeah, so let's just drill into the theory and where it might be flawed. I mean, one of the most obvious assumptions that underlines comparative advantage, I guess, is this idea that resources can flow freely from one sector to another sector and that they will be as efficiently deployed or more efficiently deployed in the sector to which they flow. That seems to sort of resonate with people up to a point in terms of some common sense there. But clearly, there are barriers to resources flowing from one sector to another, are there?
Right. Trade theory, microeconomics generally is very, as you say, it sounds like common sense and it's easy to teach to first year undergraduates. As a tutor when I was younger, I taught that sort of theory. Now, the problem with this theory is it doesn't take account of how real world economies have evolved. Traditional economics, microeconomics, it makes large assumptions about variables and it assumes all workers are the same, they're all paid according to their skill level, all industries receive the same return on capital because in equilibrium, if one industry received a higher return of capital, investors would, of course, invest more in that industry and it would grow until it moved back to the median or mean return on capital. Now, that is not how the real world works. The real world is in a constant state of flux and change and evolution. At the time Ricardo wrote his book, textiles were the number one industry, and Britain was the number one country in the world, economically speaking. Then railroads took over, and then we moved on and on. And today, everybody speaks about technology. So is mining certain minerals. And as these industries change and evolve, the entire economic landscape changes. Now, you want to know about globalization. Globalization was a success in terms of its own objective. The objective of globalization was to increase the return on capital for large international corporations by allowing them to produce in low wage countries and sell in high wage countries. So, we have to look at how that works for the country as a whole. It definitely works for the corporation. It has helped them increase their return on capital and reduce their capital base. How's it work for countries? Well, the core problem, and I've expressed this in an article I wrote on economic theory in the Real World Economic Review. The core problem is that unlike economic theory, which says that a man or woman's wages correspond directly to his skill level or her experience or whatever variable the model chooses to make the model tractable. Unlike all of that, in fact, what we have found again and again is that people who work in high profit, high growth industries get higher wages. In other words, if in 1990 you were working in the computer industry, building computers for Apple Computer, you were getting paid a lot more than, if you were building old-fashioned machinery out of nuts and bolts. Your skill level is exactly the same. Now, once we moved to globalization, China and other countries in Asia made a bid, hey, we can build all those products. So literally over 1 million jobs left America and moved to Asia. Those are high paying jobs. What happened in California then was all those people went to lower wage jobs. Some of them stayed in manufacturing, and today they're working in California. We see them working in apparel, which has got a business there, earning 30 to 50% less in real terms than they were earning in the computer industry. Some of them left manufacturing and are working in retail big box stores, earning 50% less or even more of a decline. And so the US has lost out in this process. So theoretically speaking, what I'm saying is you have to understand globalization. Theoretically, you've got to build a model in which wages depend on industries, profits, size of the company, and those variables which we know from empirical research affect wages. National income is the agglomeration of all of that. And the end result of this, and this kind of theory hasn't been built, and perhaps if I was in a university, this is what I'd be working on now, is the size of your national income and the growth rate of your national income depends crucially on what industries you have in your country, and the same for other countries. The reason why China's growth rate has been fantastic over the last 25 years is that they have gathered into China all the most successful, fast growing industries in manufacturing, largely, and that's propelled their growth rate. The reason why we in the United States essentially invented the internet and still dominate the internet. I used to work in technology. All my friends talk about a quote, fourth industrial revolution and the internet, quote, changing people's lives and all that. And what we've seen since 2000 is the worst economic growth record in the United States since the Great Depression. And this is a staggering negative achievement if you think about it. We've invented the most important technology in the world today, and we have failed to deliver growth to the 200 million Americans who would like to work.
But to push back slightly, Jeff, some would argue that America has done very well out of globalization in the whole, although trade economists accept fully that there are distributional effects which they assume can be rectified through fiscal redistributions as part of domestic policy. And the way that America, they would argue, has done well is because Americans have been able to consume more than they make, and they've been able to consume at lower prices as a result of the efficiency gains in their trading partners, particularly China. And so goods have been made available at lower prices, and the US consumer has benefited from that, even if they have suffered, in some cases, a decline in real and nominal earnings. Why is that wrong?
That's wrong because looking at consumption levels in any one year or even over a series of years is not the key variable. The key variable is, can you grow your national income per capita over time? The reason why I said the performance in the 21st century has been dreadful is that our growth rate has been around 1% in the 21st century here in the US. In the 1950s and 1960s, it was around 3%. In the 1920s, it was close to 4%. We don't have good statistics for the second half of the 19th century, but I would guess that it was also around 3%. The way you grow your economy is by growing your productivity per worker. And that's what we did through the industries that dominated this economy in the past. Now, today in Silicon Valley, in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, you've got great growth rates because a large section of the populations there is devoted to growth industries like software, search engines, social networking, all the stuff that makes up the internet. Even the area where I work, networking hardware, that is a fast growing industry because the world's telecom companies need to deploy more and more networking equipment every year. So those industries grow very rapidly and those economies are thriving, but those are small regions of a large country in which people who once worked in industries like automotive and machine tools have been demoted, in a sense, to less productive industries. Now, you asked about consumption, which gets into the issue of running a current account deficit. Would you like me to address that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, just before we come on to the current account deficit, I mean, the US is obviously a large economy. It's very self-sufficient in the essentials of life, energy and food. It's an abundant place. Not every country is as well endowed, and small and medium-sized countries have to trade, don't they? So presumably you're not arguing that just because the theory of comparative advantage has its flaws, that trade shouldn't happen. You're not arguing for autarky.
No, absolutely not. I believe in trade. I actually think the US should see trade grow as a share of GDP. But the key thing is history shows us countries that run a trade surplus tend to grow faster than countries that run a trade deficit. We run a trade deficit for 45 years, and it's been an appalling weakness and really a weakness for our economy and undermining our industrial base. And the same thing for the UK.
You're right. I mean, obviously, this in the sense that many of the newly industrialized countries, the countries that have succeeded in the post war period, such as South Korea, Taiwan, more recently China, Singapore, they have run, if not perennial, then very nearly perennial current account surpluses. And Japan, obviously, similarly. That sort of mercantilist approach, though, has its limits, or does it not have its limits in a sort of fiat money environment?
Well, when you say it has its limits, so do you mean there's a limit to the magnitude of the current account surplus, or?
I think just the continuation of the growth trajectory. If at the end of the day, consumption is the reason for people getting up and going to work, and it certainly is in my case, this sort of pursuit of current account surpluses is subsidizing other people's consumption, isn't it? And limiting your own citizens' consumption. So, does this boil down to an issue of national power versus consumer sovereignty and the rationale behind, economic progress, that you could argue that as some of these newly developed countries industrialized, they also democratized to a certain point. And that's why their economies have evolved more in a market direction, whereas perhaps China is not heading in that direction because the consumer is not sovereign.
Well, so let's leave China aside for a moment because China is a communist dictatorship, so it's unique. But the question you're asking again shows that misconceived focus on 1 year's results, suggesting that what people want in a democracy is to maximize consumption. I don't think so. I think that's what politicians want to stress because helping people consume a lot is a way to outbid the other guy running for office and win election. And we have this problem in both the US and the UK. In reality, the current account surplus helps your economy grow because it helps your industries expand. The other side of a current account surplus is domestic saving. So, as you say, people have to be willing to save, not consume quite as much to run a current account surplus. But in the East Asian countries like Singapore and South Korea, they have more of an Eastern mentality. They don't just look at this year, they look at the fact that they'd like their children and their grandchildren to have a good life too. And they're quite happy to save, let's say, 10% of their income because it means that over the next 20 or 40 or 50 years, the economy is going to grow more rapidly and be more successful and hopefully be more socially cohesive as well. What we have in the US and in the UK are politicians that tell us we can run a huge deficit, we can run up debt, interminably because it lets us consume more now. We can buy more clothing. We can buy more LED TV sets. And ultimately, I think that's the wrong way to run a country. And I think the economics profession was hired in 1990 to defend this vision of you can have it all now, and they've complied. That's where the consulting contracts were. That's where the professorships were. So they ran into this and they embraced this Ricardian vision that all that matters is this year's equilibrium. And it's a lie. It's mistaken. It's the wrong path for both the US and the UK. And by the way, in the UK, I see Liz Truss is in the newspaper this weekend saying that what she did was right. She wanted to cut taxes and run a much larger deficit so people could have more spending money in their pockets. And there was some sort of conspiracy that doomed her. And no, it wasn't a conspiracy. It was the sensible financial markets saying this woman apparently cannot add and subtract. We do not want to own these bonds. And they all sold the bonds and they did the right thing. And if I owned those bonds, I would have sold those bonds too.
So if we look at China's rise and its influence on the globalization process and the manufacturing sector, particularly in the United States, we can see the loss of manufacturing in the numbers, very evident from the United States, and we can see this rise in the concentration of global manufacturing in China. How do we actually address that? What are the right policy prescriptions to try and redress the balance?
Right. So that's a good question. And we haven't talked about the international framework because, when I say that I truly admire the economic management in Singapore, what I'm saying is I'm willing to overlook the 10% a year current account surplus they run. And I am because they're a tiny country with only, 8 million people. So it doesn't really impact the world. But there's a fundamental flaw in the system that began in Bretton Woods in 1944. That system originally intended to have a check on countries running a large current account surplus. That was taken out, ironically, by the United States. The check and the penalty on running a surplus would have stopped countries from running permanent surpluses and deindustrializing their trading partners, beggar thy neighbor policies. Since we took that out, that's allowed China and Germany, and on a much smaller scale, countries we've discussed, to run permanent surpluses. For the countries that allow themselves to run permanent deficits, that's deindustrialization, greater inequality, national security threats, and so on. So we really need a system that checks the permanent current account surplus. My own view on this is that the US, as the largest economy in the world, should say, we humbly recognize now that we made a huge mistake at Bretton Woods. We're going to implement a new system in which if a country runs both a permanent current account surplus with the world and a quasi-permanent, anything that looks like a permanent surplus, in other words, say more than 3 consecutive years and no trend to reduce that surplus, we're going to effectively stop trading with them. That doesn't mean instantaneously, but we're going to implement policies that will allow us to stop trading with them. So if it were up to me, if President Biden asked me what to do, I would say, well, we've already got tariffs on half of our imports from China. I would immediately slap the tariffs on the other half, and I would put in a scale that those tariffs are going to go up by, say, 10 percentage points a year until we see China running, at least moving aggressively towards current account balance with the world and with the United States. And I would be very happy for us not to trade at all with China in 5 or 10 years' time, because you know what? China makes nothing that's unique. It is a country that has been built up through stealing other people's ideas for manufacturing, and it still makes almost entirely goods that you can buy somewhere else. And China has proven that by moving a large section of its Chinese exports to Southeast Asia and Mexico. That was done with no problem at all. A country that really has unique technology, it'd be very hard for them to move 10 or 20 or 30% of their production process to another country.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that maybe the emphasis on a bilateral trade relationship doesn't make as much sense as the emphasis on the overall country's global position, precisely because of those third country involved in the global value chain and what have you. But the clear barrier seems to have been over the last 20 years, or much of the last 20 years, a reluctance on China's part, or the current account surplus countries generally's part, to stimulate domestic demand to a level that brings their current account back to balance. And therefore, a disproportionate amount of the responsibility for ensuring there is sufficient demand in the world has fallen upon the United States. It's become this kind of consumer of last resort. But implementing a more balanced global economy or encouraging a more balanced global economy is going to require a lot of cooperation, isn't it? And, the level of cooperation that existed in the World Trade Organization in the early part of this century seems to have been sort of inadequate for the job in hand. But that was before the organization and the multilateral trading system generally started to fray at the edges. Now, I would argue if it wasn't fit for purpose before, it'd be very hard to imagine it being fit for purpose now. So do we not sort of enter into a period here of sort of trade anarchy?
Yeah, you could call it trade anarchy, or you could call it the revolt of the dumping ground countries. As you say, the United States has been the dumping ground for dozens of countries, really, that want to expand production. This is, you're more concerned with the global system than I am, because, the British typically are more concerned with global issues, and they like global negotiations. They've been to Geneva, and hey, it's got good restaurants and it's a lot sunnier than London in the winter. Number one, I'd like to see the United States show more leadership and say, and have what I would consider a real economist, of which there are very few in this country, who understands policy and understands how the world really works, and say, look, this system is broken. The United States is going to lead the way towards a better system. If we announced and implemented a policy which would mean, hey, we're going to effectively stop trading with China in 8 years and stop trading with Germany in 8 years, then the rest of the world would say, oh my God, we no longer have number one dumping ground. Dumping grounds number two and three, Britain and Australia, are likely to follow the US lead because the logic is so strong. Now we'll come to the negotiating table, and now we're ready for a new Bretton Woods. But I don't see that happening if we all say, hey, let's go to Geneva and talk. I mean, China will simply, lie and bamboozle every single meeting, and every single year that they can sell us $500 billion worth of goods that we should be producing here is a win for them. And you're absolutely right. They don't want to increase domestic consumption. And that's because an educated populace becomes more democratic and they will overthrow the Communist Party. I mean, the humiliation the Communist Party suffered in December by having to reverse itself on COVID, I'm sure has got them scared, and I'm sure has made them think we need to hold wages down even more. They've got a rich class which can shop at Chanel and Louis Vuitton, but 90% of the population needs to be held down. So how do you change that is part of what you're asking me, and that's my view, is the US has to show leadership because global meetings and global organizations don't get anywhere.
And the CHIPS Act, which the European Union seemed to be imitating, or at least making noises along the lines of a more involved industrial policy. How does this sort of deepening of industrial policy amongst the sort of economic superpowers threaten trade generally? And is it going to work? I mean, plenty of classical economists and neoclassical economists recognized the need for industrial policy. What held them back tended to be a lack of faith that political power could actually implement it well. And therefore, a lot of them actually decided that it was best not to engage in it at all rather than have it done badly. Is there evidence that politicians in the United States or in the European Union are capable of implementing expensive industrial policy well?
There's plenty of evidence that they will implement that policy and almost any policy badly. And you're right there that that is a concern I have. I mean, I guess the starting point is to say very clearly the conclusion from my modifications to free trade theory is that different industries matter. The best industries pay more, generate more profit, generate more investment, and grow faster and generate more new technologies. So the global economy is, in a sense, a war for the best industries. We have to make sure it doesn't turn into a shooting war, but it's still a war. Now, the semiconductor industry is definitely one of the best industries. We need it in the US. Another point, by the way, is that so-called efficiency gains and scale economies do not exist as a regionalization of the economy. In other words, you can achieve the same scale making chips for all of Europe and making chips for all of North America as you can making chips globally. So it makes a lot of sense to have a CHIPS Act for the United States, which we now have, and to see something similar implemented by the European Union. As you say, though, there's a worry that it will be done badly. And, we are encumbered by a democratic government with a small d and a Congress that's divided and that is full of people who have very little understanding of business. This is not economics, this is business. How do you build a successful chip company? Morris Chang of Taiwan Semi is absolutely right when he says costs are lower in Taiwan than the United States. But the main reasons are that it can take 6 to 10 years to get approval for an industrial facility or some other facility in this country. The planning permissions, the environmental restrictions are all very severe. On top of that, we do not have nearly enough students studying semiconductor related technologies in universities, and our government seems absolutely oblivious to the fact that subsidizing higher education for every single liberal arts subject in the world, as well as the sciences, isn't solving the problem. We need to subsidize and direct kids more into these STEM subjects, give them a free ride, make it expensive to study, in one university here, you can do a degree in Bob Dylan's music. I love Bob Dylan's music, but I don't think that's where our higher education resources should go. So there are lots of reasons why the government mismanages our economy and mismanages investment in technology. So I agree with you. But then you get to the fundamental question, should we just give up and become completely dependent on semiconductors manufactured in Asia? And as you probably know, China has been waging a campaign through all means to move semiconductor manufacturing from Taiwan and Japan and Singapore into China. So there's a large national security element. So I think we've got to try. And Europe's got to try, and I support Europe trying.
So, Jeff, coming back to theory versus reality, there's a school of thought really that economic theory evolved as a support for policymaking rather than in a sort of scientific approach of finding new enlightenment through empirical study. Given that policy making seems to be changing very dramatically and that the sort of free trade, laissez faire dominance of much of the last 40 years seems to be fading, do you think that we're going to see a rebirth of discussion about trade theory and that actually the academic economic profession will start to move in the direction of back towards a sort of government intervention in trade and a focus on the theoretical flaws in the what we now consider to be orthodox trade theory to reflect the new reality?
Stuart, I think economic theory is bankrupt, frankly. I do not see it moving in a more useful direction. From where I sit here in Washington, D.C., economists are divided into those on the right who preach free markets as the answer to everything, and those on the left who preach redistribution as the answer to everything. And every single economic issue is shoehorned into that prism, and what economists say is often useless. So I'm not very optimistic about economics. I mean, it may take a much more severe crisis before these things change in the US and the UK. I think in other countries, in some of the best economics books I've read are by people from countries in the Baltic states and elsewhere. They've got some good ideas because they are, as you say, more focused on how can we help our country grow and thrive. Economists in this country are focused on, and they say so, they're focused on what can I teach my students that my students will understand. And Keynes said that David Ricardo came up with this theory which involves short-term equilibrium between different factors of production, and it took over economics as surely as the Holy Inquisition took over Spain in the 1400s. And I think that stands as an accurate metaphor. And thankfully, Spain has done away with the Inquisition and is today a democracy. Economics is still under the Inquisition of short-term equilibrium being the answer to every problem. And anybody with any common sense can see it's not the answer to every problem because we all have bigger problems and bigger concerns than this year making sure we've got a free market solution.
Jeff Ferry from the Coalition for a Prosperous America, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart. Pleasure talking to you.